Welcome and thank you for joining us at the EIT Future of Food Conference to explore the global agenda for agri-food research, innovation and investment to reach SDG 2 ahead of the upcoming 2021 UN Food Systems Summit. My name is Uzor Amaka Madu. I'm a strategic communications consultant at What's in It for Africa, and I will be your moderator for this session. By way of logistics, can I encourage you all to please send in your questions to the panelists via the chat box from the very start of the session, so now, so that we can address them during the Q&A towards the end. Please remember to state your name, organisation, and who the question is directed towards. Thank you. So our conversation today looks to the global agenda on agri-food research, innovation and investment. Next year, the UN Food Systems Summit will focus on transforming the way the world produces and consumes food. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says that it is unacceptable that hunger is on the rise at a time when the world wastes more than 1 billion tons of food every year. So transforming food systems is really crucial for delivering all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, COVID-19 has made the fight to end global hunger that much more difficult. The UN estimates the pandemic will double the number of people exposed to potential food crises. This means there is an urgent need to reconsider what can be done by way of investment into the agri-food sector, and also what are the research and innovation priorities needed to transform the way we produce and consume food, ensuring no one is left behind. And in today's session, we're going to unpack these global challenges while looking at workable solutions. And to start us off, we have a video presentation from Maximo Torero-Cullen, who is the Chief Economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization. Prior to joining FAO, Maximo was the World Bank Group Executive Director, and before this, he led the division of the Markets, Trade and Institutions at the International Food Policy Research Institute.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I will try to present what we think are the important issues that we need to look at in terms of the future of food towards 2021 UN Food Systems Summit. Let me start by saying the situation we were before the COVID-19. First, we had 690 million people in the world which were undernourished. We have significant issues of overweight and obesity. We also have 14% of the food that was lost in the production. And that's something that is kind of unacceptable given the situation that we have with the level of undernourishment. We also face a situation where we have 3 billion people in the world which cannot afford healthy diets. This map is showing in the darker red color, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, that 75 to 100% of the people didn't have access to healthy diets. In a world that we have a problem of undernourishment, a problem of overweight and obesity. So this was all happening before COVID-19. But one more dimension, which normally we don't talk too much about, is inequality. And before COVID-19, income inequality was rising nearly half in half of the countries of the world. So this increase in inequality will continue and will even be exacerbated even more with the case of COVID-19. And that's something that we need to look at very closely, because if we have these levels of inequality, we won't be able to achieve SDG 1 and SDG 2 in a sustainable way. Now, when we are talking about the agri-food system transformation, what we need to achieve is basically being able to achieve SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, but also, as I mentioned before, SDG 10, reduction of inequalities. And this agri-food system transformation requires a balance between sustainable production and environment. It needs to use technologies and innovation like artificial intelligence, data, but it requires a systemic thinking. It requires to understand what are the trade-offs that we have to go through to be able to accomplish those goals. If I am going to achieve zero hunger, I will have to implement policies, and those policies will have trade-offs. We know, for example, that agriculture will create trade-offs. It will create trade-offs on emissions. It will affect water, soils, energy, biodiversity. It will also affect land inequality. So we need to measure those to see what are the paths and the optimal paths that will allow us to achieve these SDGs with the minimum trade-offs. And the way to do it is to understand their magnitude and understand which are the policies that could work to minimize those. And next to it, we need to find which is the governance and institutional capacity building that we need to do to be able to achieve this. So thinking in a systematic way means understanding that we have a clear objective function that we want to accomplish, but at the same time, understanding the magnitude of the trade-offs and how those trade-offs will affect all the other SDGs and how we can minimize that. As part of the Food System Summit, we are looking into modeling exercises to do that, and we're looking at trade-offs in water, soil, energy, biodiversity, emissions, land inequality, and income inequality. So whatever path that we follow to achieve these objective functions, we will take into account those trade-offs and identify the policies that will minimize them. Now, the UN Food System Summit 2021 will be launch bold new actions to progress on all the 17 SDGs and start a global transformation that will allow us to achieve this agri-food system transformation. It has been designed in 5 tracks. The track 1 is to ensure access to safe and nutritious food for all. Track 2 is shift to sustainable consumption patterns. Track 3, boost nature positive production. Track 4, advance equitable livelihoods. And track 5, build resilience for vulnerabilities, shocks, and stress. At the same time, FAO is trying to work with different sets of tools that will allow us to accelerate this process of the agri-food system transformation. We have developed food systems dashboards together with our colleagues in GAIN and Johns Hopkins. These allow us to understand what are the trade-offs and what is the information available in each of the different countries. We are empowering our food agricultural policy decision analysis tool, the FABDA, so that we can track policies being implemented. We have our big data tool and the data lab, which is bringing also the food insecurity experience scales to assess the situation, especially during COVID-19. And we have our hand-in-hand initiative, which is trying to prioritize and use territorial approaches to be able to target interventions to allow to achieve this agri-food system transformation. And we also have our food loss and waste platform, because we believe that food losses and reduction of these 14% of losses, and whatever waste it is, which could be even higher, is essential because it's a triple win. It allows to have more food available. It allows to use our resources more efficiently by minimizing the use and making it more efficient of natural resources, but also minimizing emissions. But it also allows us to increase efficiency of production. And finally, we have to track prices, and we have to keep monitoring our prices. The 5 principles that we have in the hand-in-hand initiative is basically to target the poorest, use matchmaking to bring donors, bring the mandate of FAO, but try to develop differentiated strategies that will allow us to prioritize interventions, optimizing them rather than duplicating. And for that, we have developed a database of donor interventions, which is geospatially referenced. But also we have developed our hand-in-hand geospatial platform that allow us to implement these territorial approaches so that we can target interventions and find solutions. And together we build partnerships to be able to achieve the goals, because this goes farther than just the mandate of FAO. We have to do other activities in the rural areas to be able to achieve SDG 1, SDG 2, and SDG 10. The European dimension and the Europeans have developed their own transformation and their own guidelines on how to do this. You have the European Union Green Deal, Farm to Fork and Biodiversity Strategy, the Common Agricultural Policy, which is supposed to support this European Green Deal, and they have put ambitious targets on the use of pesticides, fertilizers, antimicrobials, soil fertility, and organic farming. And of course, the EU bilateral agreements and international fora. All these will help and of course support this agri-food system transformation, where every region is taking their own priorities on how to implement them. Now, what is important is that COVID-19 has exacerbated the problems. We know that there will be an increase in the number of undernourishment of 130 million people more into undernourishment, around 115 million people moving into extreme poverty. We are losing a decade or more of reduction of extreme poverty. So it's important to help now to build back better so that we are more resilient. And being more resilient means that we are able to predict and we are able to assess the risks in advance. But second is that we are able to cope with the risks. So we need to understand the risks. And to be able to do that, to be able to understand the risks, to have predictive power and to how to cope with them, we also need to scale up partnerships and investments. And we need to improve the way we operate today and take the advantage of what is happening in COVID-19 to build back better. For us, what this means is to work with 4 accelerators: data, big data, real-time data, innovation, technology. But one accelerator which normally could decelerate at the beginning is what we call complements. This is governance, human capital, and institutions. These are central for the other three accelerators to move sustainably. It could be that the three accelerators without the complements can move initially at a very high speed. But what we want is that they continue to move at a speed. And the only way we can do that is to bring these complements that will help to bring governance and human capital and institutions and capabilities so that they can move sustainable. So this could have an initial cost of slowing the velocity of technology, innovation, and data, but will allow us to, in the future, to move faster and sustainable. And that, for us, is at the core of the Building Back Better. How we plan to minimize risk? First, we need to increase and invest more in early warning systems to have capacity to predict the risks from occurring. Second, we also need to focus on the One Health approach as promoted by FAO, OIE, and WHO, which has enormous potential to prevent the emergence of new zoonotic reservoirs from the current COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, we need to increase access to agricultural insurance, combining index-based insurance, traditional insurance, and access to finance. That will help us to go better with climate change. So those three elements, predictive power, One Health approach, and insurance facilities will allow us to minimize risk. This is basically what we can do in terms of the early warning system and what we are trying to do in our situation room to bring all the different elements on prices, on commodities, on zoonotic diseases, on pests and diseases in one place so that we can create a capacity using artificial intelligence to be able to predict better the future so that we can have more predictive power and therefore to be able to understand and manage better the risks. Second, to be able to cope with the risk, which is the second component of resilience, we need to link recovery plans to four interrelated actions. And that's the opportunity, linking the recovery plans. First, focus on social protection mechanisms to support access to food for the poor and those whose incomes is most affected. We need to work with them. We need to innovate. Second, align incentives. This means redirect subsidies on farm support from staples to high-value commodities. Third, use trade to boost farmers' productivity and income. Trade brings a more efficient use of the resources, but at the same time allows food to flow, which improves food security and nutrition, more access, more availability, and more stability in the way food is distributed in the world. We need to link value chain infrastructure initiatives to financial systems, and we need to use technology wisely to invest in digital innovations in food and agriculture. So let me briefly go on what we have been doing. We have been working with our partners in identifying which are the investments that will pay back better in terms of reduction of undernourishment. And clearly, there is a set of investments which show that if we use $1 in those type of activities, we will get a higher return in terms of undernourishment. And this graph is showing that curve of returns to investments. Which are those? We have investments mix, which has the largest effect to reduce hunger. We have the ones that will assure sustainability, and we have the ones that will require some policy changes. For example, first, we need to scale up the rate of cash transfers, because we know today, in this graph, for example, that the level of demand that we are requiring of food cash transfers because of COVID-19 is enormous. And in many cases, it's over the global average for many countries. But this is the percentage of the increase that we need in each of the cash transfer programs to be able to satisfy the situation of COVID. So it's comparing the pre-COVID to what is needed post-COVID. So we need to do a significant investment on cash transfer programs. Second, we know that the investment in infrastructure has significant returns in terms of getting more nutritious food to market at lower cost. And this is showing the results of public investments in infrastructure across different countries in Africa and how it is increasing in terms of reduction of the average annual cost of reduction per person of undernourishment. Similarly, we know that there is necessary important value chain technologies and infrastructure that needs to be in place, like storage, handling infrastructure, market infrastructure, processing infrastructure that will allow us to accelerate and to improve the efficiency of the value chains. And as a result of that, of course, reduce losses in the production side. It's also important that we need to understand that the big cities is not the solution. The solution is to work with the surrounding cities. And this is what this map is showing. Basically, the blue are the intermediate cities where most of the value chain production will happen, the processing and the packaging, where we can accelerate and connect them better to infrastructure so that we can take advantage. Let's look, for example, at the case of Nigeria, and this is a hand-in-hand country. Look at the blue areas, which are the intermediate cities. Those are the ones that are going to be connected to the big cities and the ones that will assure the continuum from rural areas. There is where the development of rural value chains should happen. And that's why we need to improve the infrastructure in those locations. So we need to be very strategic. And the use of this type of geospatial information will be extremely useful. Also, we need to know that funding the gap for digital technologies will cost around 125 billion to a maximum of 2,100 billion. But if we just focus at the 125 billion, which is the dark blue area in the regions, and look at Africa, we're talking of 36 billion, maximum 139 million, but the median of 97 billion. That's what we need to be able to reduce the digital gap. Cannot we do that? I think it's important because this will help to accelerate the process of digital technologies. And that's the change that we can know. We know these technologies create a huge return in terms of reduction of undernourishment. And let me just finalize with the topic, which I think is a triple win: reduction of food losses. If we reduce food losses, we will improve food security and nutrition, we will improve productivity, and we will reduce the use and make it more efficient, the use of natural resource, and also reduce emissions. This is something that we can do, and it's something that we should accelerate. And I think it's across the summit, it's across the strategies of the European deal. So it's something that I think we need to move fast and act, because it's a triple win that we cannot miss in this opportunity. So we need to leverage science, we need to develop new business models, and we need to create sustainability. All these have to be done in a sustainable way, minimizing our trade. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this presentation was useful. Thank you again.
Fantastic. So we've heard from Maximo about some of the key challenges, but also some of the solutions that at FAO they are actually taking on board and they're pushing forward. What I would like to do now is really to turn to the rest of the panel to start making their introductory remarks based on Maximo's presentation, and to really unpack their perspective on the challenges and the issues underlying some of these challenges, like hunger, undernourishment, waste. Of course, we need a firm understanding and agreement about what are the challenges in order to craft solutions going forward. So to start, joining us would be Saswati Bora. She is Head of Food Systems Innovation at the World Economic Forum, where she leads WEF's 2 global initiatives on technology innovations and incentives to address food system challenges, and the food and agriculture regional work in India. Saswati has almost 2 decades of experience in developing and leading ambitious agendas on food systems, innovation, sustainable agriculture, and rural development, including at the World Bank. So it's quite a sufficient CV. So we're really excited to have you join the conversation, Saswati. Can I ask you to focus in your introductory remarks on some of the main challenges to be tackled in our food system from a research and innovation perspective?
Thank you, Uzo, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for this very interesting session. And I want to really thank Maximo for a very insightful presentation. I think just following up on what Maximo presented, I think there are 5 key themes that kind of resonated with me on food systems transformation. The first one is on the importance of adopting an integrated systems approach. And I think we are more and more understanding that if we need to feed around 9.7 billion people nutritiously by 2050 while meeting the SDGs, we need to food systems need to meet 4 key aspirations, and these include: first, food systems need to be sustainable. They need to minimize environmental impact, conserve scarce resources, and save biodiversity loss. They need to be nutritious and healthy to promote more safe and nutritious food for a healthy diet. They need to be efficient to minimize food loss and waste, and they need to be inclusive, which includes providing food security, economic and social inclusion for all, including smallholder farmers, women, and youths. But we know that we are not meeting some of these aspirational goals, and really to create that kind of a transformation, I think what we really need is a really integrated systems approach that really looks at how do we create the positive, tangible benefits for both people and planet. The second theme that resonated was on trade-offs and synergies, and I think Maximo laid it out really well, but because there are trade-offs and there are possible synergies between meeting our food security objectives, climate objectives, health objectives, and socioeconomic and livelihood objectives. And for example, the high cost of producing environmentally and socially responsible foods may make it more expensive to some consumers and may lead to loss of income for some producers. So we really need to understand these trade-offs, and governments need to account for this by providing the appropriate safety nets to protect and compensate the poor and vulnerable. And I think Maximo laid it out quite well about the importance of the role of cash transfers in this. But to manage and make those trade-off decisions, I think governments have to balance a lot of objectives and priorities. And I think we need to also develop the capacity of governments to give them the tools, technical skills, and data to create those, to make those policy-making changes that really takes into account the trade-offs and synergies. The third theme that resonated was the role of realigning incentives. I think it was very clear that we really require fundamental change in the way our food is produced, and which includes changing the practices of 500 million smallholder farmers around the world and the way food is consumed. And that requires several transitions. We need to move towards more production efficiency, reduce food loss and waste, healthier diets, inclusive livelihoods. But who pays for these transitions? And I think Maximo's presentation quite highlighted quite well that we need those incentives that can overcome hurdles that's preventing stakeholders currently from making this change. And they need to really account for those transition costs, behavior change costs, and really create be powerful to change the mindset of billions of individuals worldwide. Now, many of these incentive mechanisms were put in place decades back when the food security and self-sufficiency were more prioritized. But now that we have a more integrated understanding of food systems, we need to repurpose this. And at the World Economic Forum, we identified around 4 pathways in a report that was launched earlier this year. And the first pathway to incentivizing food systems is on really looking at how do we repurpose public investments and subsidies, which, as Maximo articulated, could is capable of bringing rapid and widespread change. And there's a huge opportunity to do that now, given COVID and the opportunity to build back better. But besides the subsidies, I think the 3 other pathways I would like to highlight is that we should also focus on how we shift consumer demand to more environmentally and social responsible food. How do we incentivize companies to redesign business models to prioritize environmental, social, and financial outcomes? And how do we incentivize institutional investors to set more high standards in respect to how companies target these outcomes? So I think we need to really look at how do we create incentives across all of these 4 pathways to realign food systems transformation. And the fourth theme that resonated was the role of technology innovations, which we know provides significant opportunities to transform food systems. But however, we need to look beyond technologies to broader innovations, which includes business model innovation, institutional capacity, innovations in financing, and so forth, to create the transformational change that we require. And that brings me to the last theme, which was clear, is that the role of multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think it's pretty clear that there is not one stakeholder group that can manage this complexity on their own. And so the role of collective action, whether it's at global, regional, and country level, where individual countries, civil society, research organization, private sector, farm organizations come together to work towards collective solutions and create those multi-stakeholder solutions, will be key to really creating the transformation that we need. With that, I hand it over to you, Ujo.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Saswati. That's a lot of food for thought. And with our next speaker, I'm hoping that we can discuss a bit more about the business models to tackle. Our next speaker is Sean Wescott. He's a Senior Vice President, Research and Development Europe at PepsiCo, one of the largest food and drink companies in the world. And Sean has experienced many different aspects of research and innovation in business, including renovating a core portfolio, innovating new growth platforms, partnering with startups, technology partners, and managing mergers and acquisitions. So we welcome him to this discussion, and also open the floor to reflect on Maximo's presentation from the private sector perspective, and perhaps pick up on some of the aspects that Saswati was talking about in terms of what are some of the challenges around business models in this context. Thank you.
Thanks, Uzo, and thanks to the organisers of the conference. It's a pleasure to be here today and represent Pepsi and I suppose also the private sector. I'd also like to thank Maximo for a thought-provoking presentation. What resonated to me in was Maximo's reference to the need for balance between sustainable production and the environment, and the role of technologies, data and AI in systems thinking in agri-food systems transformation. PepsiCo is a business built on agriculture, working directly with farmers to source many ingredients for our products. Since I joined in February this year, heading up R&D in Europe, I've been impressed to see how the data from our farmers is fueling innovation in how we approach agriculture so we can do more for the planet. Not just what we can, but what is needed to work within planetary boundaries. Systems thinking is very important to this, as we realize we can't work in isolation as a private enterprise. We need to think about the broader food system and how we can have a multiplier effect by collaborating beyond our business, and external innovation is key to this. At PepsiCo, we believe that a green future lies in innovation. We need to provide signposts to farmers on green agri-technology to help them understand which technologies will have a real impact, differentiating policy and support to reward farmers who transition to sustainable practices, and looking at setting standards to bring everyone forward together. As I'm representing the private sector and in a way the consumer, one of the most powerful trends we see is that consumers want their food made only from ingredients they know and trust. Maximo referred to how the transformation of the food system in Europe sets ambitious targets on the use of pesticides, fertilizers, antimicrobials, soil fertility, and organic farming. And I can only confirm that this is what the consumers are looking for more and more. If there's one thing that can make all of this happen, it is all about data. Science leads our thinking, and science eats data for breakfast. If we can build standard data keys in open architecture to link data from multiple sources, equipment GPS, soil survey, weather data, satellite imagery, this will enable innovation as we can leverage the power of AI and machine learning to see the systems and target innovation where it's most impactful for farmers and their communities. Certainly listening to Saswati speak before me, I can see that when we look at it from the different perspective, whether it's from the perspective of the private sector or from the government, the regulators, I think we're seeing the same problems. And this aspect of particularly how digital technology and systems thinking is so important to tackle these challenges. I'll hand it back to you now, Uzo.
Thank you, Sean, for that. I really, as you said, data is a critical issue in all of this. We need to understand exactly what the scale of the problem and the challenge is and connect those dots in order to work together to come up with those solutions. So not working in isolation is critical, especially when we think about food systems. I'm now going to turn to Andy Zinger, who is the CEO at the European Institute of Innovation and Technology Food. Before joining EIT Food, Andy built and turned around several businesses in Europe and the USA, and engineered a successful exit for open innovation service leader, 9 Sigma, which he ran for 10 years. Andy, welcome to the discussion. Could you also reflect on some of the pertinent points from Maximo's presentation and guide us through your thinking about some of the key investment challenges you see in the agri-food sector?
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor, and really appreciate Maximo's presentation and also your introduction. So thank you on that. So I'm going to go at this from a slightly different angle, and I think it's mostly due to 2 reasons. First of all, I think the challenges in the food system are pretty well defined, right? So there are more coming all the time. You know, there's the thing about data. There's all kinds of different priorities, right? So, but I think what has to happen is that the local players have to come together as one great coalition and set up hubs. So we as an organization, EIT Food is a European Union funded ecosystem. So what we do is we manage and deploy this ecosystem to achieve impact targets around malnutrition, around impact of food systems on the environment. And for the past 4 years, we've been setting up hubs. So, and those hubs really work in the platform business model. And again, the situation is quite similar. So food waste, food loss, hunger, overweight. The main ingredient I think that's missing is to connect all these different networks with each other. So in other words, you have industry, you have universities, you have government, and all of these different players have sometimes diverging interests. Agreeing, and again, and this is different from region to region, maybe even from those blue cities to blue cities that were shown earlier, is to understand what are the priorities, the specific priorities, because they are the guiding compass for those regions to then go and say, this is my plan, how to tackle this, right? Because I think it's not like one size fits all, because the problems in Europe are, again, similar, but differently accentuated. And by setting up a kind of a platform model whereby the different networks get connected, you understand the value, that's one great way to do it. And what we do at EIT Food is we connect universities, we connect industry, civil society, and all these other players who then we jointly then finance projects that help to improve the situation with the food system. I think one big factor that's oftentimes not spoken about so much, but is really an upstream element of innovation, is education. I think there's a lot to be done in educating farmers, educating other players on the food value chain about transportation, logistics, making sure that the cold warehouses and such like are all set up. So I think that's an important piece, is to have all the players come together, create a kind of a hub, and then what we need eventually is a kind of a hub of hubs, so to speak, the platform of platforms, which maybe the FAO can be. But I think overall also there isn't enough invested in the whole food system. When you look at 20% of the GDP is generated with the food system, but only 6% of venture capital investments go in there. And when you think about that globally, 436 billion US dollars are spent on climate change mitigation, but only 1% of that amount is actually spent worldwide on research and innovation in the food system. So there's still a long way to go. And I think all the players together have to understand that it's around the financing. So I totally agree that, one top priority for some of the places could well be the cash transfers. But there could also be other pieces, right? So they need to be agreed on. Finances have to be made available. More investments has to go into startups that create local jobs and the local ecosystem. And we at EIT Food, certainly, we've been doing this for the past 4 years. We have 15 hubs in those regions in Europe that are known to be a little bit less well developed in terms of innovation capacity. And the results are done well, so they all link up into a central platform, which then coordinates all the efforts as a knowledge repository, and we learn from learning. So we got to avoid reinventing the wheel, really, is the thing, and that's unfortunately happening too much out there. So much more to share, but I think most importantly is, again, to have all the players, public and private, come together and define the priorities. I think that is the key to really, that's one big part of the problem space, is to understand how to actually sort that and say, number 1, 2, and 3 priorities are X, Y, and Z.
Thank you. And indeed, touching on that point about deciding what the priorities are at a global level, because they are and can be so different from local to regional to global. Let's unpack that a bit and understand from a technology perspective in the global food system, how do we ensure that we're setting global priorities and serving those global priorities that also meet local needs and vice versa? What are some of the other examples, aside from EIT, where this is done? I'd like, if first of all, we could maybe put that to Maximo. Where can we set this global agenda and these priorities, and how can we be sure that they reflect local needs? What needs to be done?
Thank you so much, and I really enjoyed the comments. I think that priorities will change region by region, and that's, I think, a misconception that people have been raising, that the Global Food System Summit will resolve the problem. No. The Global Food System Summit will set up some of the things and the challenges and how we need to act quickly, but it will vary in every country, in every region. And what we're trying to do is to understand what are those intensities and what is the intensity of those trade-offs in each country, in each region of the world. Like, for example, simple, water has a higher intensity in the Sahara, in the desert. It has also a higher intensity of a problem in India. And that's where you need to focus on that trade-off, because you cannot afford a trade-off on water use. You have to be extremely efficient the way you use water. Biodiversity could be bigger in another region. At the end of the line, as much as we understand those magnitudes, which today we don't know, and that's the big missing data that we have. People have been talking about SDGs in silos. They have not interacted them. And the summit and the systems approach is trying to bring them together and trying to understand the interaction. But it's very difficult to interact 17 SDGs. You need to have very clear objective functions. And our position is, our objective function of a food system summit is SDG 2 and SDG 1. Because that's what we want to achieve. We want to achieve zero hunger, and we want to increase income, SDG 1, so that you can achieve zero hunger. That will create trade-offs in the other 15 SDGs, for sure. And that's where we need to prioritize policies to minimize those. But if we don't have a clarity of the objective function and the magnitude of those trade-offs, we won't be able to come with solutions. There are tons of solutions. We have done cost-benefit analysis of how to reduce losses here and there. But the problem is, we need to understand where we need to put the accelerator, where we need to bring the innovation, the technology, the data. And for that, data is central. Geospatial data, information of what is happening where, modeling to be able to measure those trade-offs, that is central. What we want at the end of the line, and let me finish there, is I like to have precision farming on smallholders. Those are the ones that have the bigger budget constraint. Those are the ones that should be using the more efficient way their resources. Because today they are overusing pesticides, they are overusing fertilizers, which are not fit for their land. There is a lot of mismatch on what is needed to what they should be using. And that could create the sustainability that we are looking for. Without changing too much, it's just improving how we use the resources. And we can do that. I think with the technologies we have today, it's just an issue of finding ways in which we can accelerate and customize to the needs of the local areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And building on the customization and accelerating these technologies to make sure that they do reach local people and they do fulfill local needs. So Swati, could you talk to us a bit more about the work you've been doing and also how we can practically scale up these solutions?
Thank you, Uzo. And I think I agree quite a lot with what Maximo just mentioned about the having the balance between the global and the local. I think we need to, think ambitious, use global flow frameworks and alliances and resources, but really look at how do we, advance local and regional priorities. And I think what we saw in COVID was quite clear is that we had a more than average production systems, but it was a disruption of local supply chains, so which was a problem. So I think in terms of scaling technology and how we can look towards that, we really need to look at the countries will choose a bespoke model which is based on their national priorities, and they need to balance economic and social and environmental objective with national security objectives. And the key is to really look at what is the key pressing development and commercialization challenge in a given market and the conditions that would be needed to resolve these. And then how can we deploy technology and broader innovations to bring those, accelerate change, to create those solutions that could have scalable impact. And what we are seeing a lot is that there are technologies that are there, but they are not scalable. They are not creating the desired impact because a food and agriculture sector is is complex, right? So food and agriculture sector has been really behind in leveraging these technology innovations, given the fragmentation and lack of scale, and also because of our operational complexity. So I think what we are trying to do is to create and look at it and sort of from an ecosystem perspective. So really looking beyond just a specific technology initiatives and stakeholder, but to really take an ecosystem view that could see, okay, what is a big development challenge we want to solve for that in that context, and how can sort of this innovation fit in, and how do we then create that enabling environment and what we call innovation ecosystems that can sort of unlock the key investments, create the aligned policy incentives, build capacity, and develop those smart partnerships so that we can achieve the scale and impact that we are looking for. And I think one of the ways we are trying to do that is by developing what we call the food innovation hubs, which are very much focused on strengthening the local innovation ecosystems. And we're doing so by really trying to create those human-centered and purpose-driven networks that are locally owned. They are focusing on solving a specific development or commercialization challenge. They're focusing on broader innovation and not just technology. So looking at both high-end technology, but also low-cost grassroots innovations, looking at business model innovation, capacity building, but then also really looking at how do we then bring in other actors and initiatives that are already existing there. And I really like what Andy said, let's not try to recreate the wheel and not drown out what's already existing in a local context, but really build on existing initiatives and stakeholders and partnerships that are there to create that scale and impact going forward. So so this is how we are sort of defining it. And I think one of the things that we could also see is also to really look at what are the innovations that are emerging out of adjacent sectors and industries. So for example, what are the learnings from sort of the energy sector that we can learn? What are the innovations that are happening there that can be deployed to the ag and food sector? And then also, how do we share these learnings across geographies to create those scalable impact?
Brilliant, thank you. And like you said, spreading that across geographies to really make that impact. I want to now turn to Sean. Your experience over a number of different markets for a leading food brand. What have been some of your learnings in terms of innovation and technology and research for the food system? How have you been able to leverage this research and innovation within your own company, but then also work with others outside of your kind of silo or outside of the private sector? What does that look like?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to take a strategic approach. And we had some discussion on priorities. My thoughts on the priorities are, I think there's a lot of commonality around those priorities, which is important to see where we can find scale. I think the hierarchy of those priorities and how they manifest themselves in different geographies and locations clearly changes. But what the power behind that thinking is that you can actually build knowledge around where you see these priorities. And to build on Andy's point is, I think this concept of creating hubs where you bring together private sector, institutions and others to build knowledge very much aligned to what the demands of the priorities are, and with an understanding of how that priority will manifest itself, and ultimately that knowledge will be applied as a technology for benefit locally. So this global local is important, but we need to keep our eye on where is the scale within what we're talking about. And I think then the other role of technology is as an enabler. So one is to build the knowledge to be able to tackle the problems. The other is to use the technology to apply it. An example I can give you from our organization is something that we call iCrop. We have about 48,000 hectares growing potatoes under iCrop across 16 different markets. And that allows us to collect over 1,000 data points from those fields, from the crop performance, the soil type, the weather, irrigation, water use, as well as 640 million data points across that. So it's a huge amount of data we're generating off those farms. Million data points on the field and 640 million data points for weather. And put that all together through a mobile web platform, we're able to provide very specific information that's very valuable to those farmers that they can use and apply directly. An example of this is in Spain, where we farm potatoes, where we were able to improve the benefit from irrigation that was scheduled from 40% being productive on the farm to 93%. So, this concept of commonality amongst the priorities, a strategic approach, building the knowledge in the hubs beyond just the private enterprise, but with partnerships, and then being able to use technology as a platform to transmit that to where it's going to have the most impact. That's the kind of systems thinking that we need to have. And as Andy pointed out, there's still linkages or missing hubs in that system. So I think by understanding the priorities well, collectively, institutions, governments, private sector, coming together in those hubs, that's where we can start to put it all together even better.
Brilliant. Yeah, definitely. And I want to keep on with kind of the private sector perspective and bring Andy in here to really look at how we can develop new business models that prioritize sustainable food systems. Because we've talked a bit about technologies, we've talked about the prioritization, and you picked up on the lack of investment actually in this sector, even though it's driving the economy. So what can we do about that? Because all of these solutions cost money. How do we develop new business models that prioritize sustainable food systems?
Yeah, thank you for the cue. And I'm gonna, I think Saswati also mentioned business models, which I think is absolutely the key to really solving many of these issues, right? And I'll give you some examples. So Maximo mentioned connecting the unconnected, right? So, and that means we have to have rural wireless connectivity in order to actually be able to provide the precision farming tools and enablement to the smallhold farmers. And that's one first step for business models, right? So what if telecommunication companies can be asked to provide the connectivity free of charge in the first instance, where the farmers don't pay for the equipment, but actually just have some other income streams or have governments subsidize it, i.e. that's just being paid for. You mentioned cash transfers. That would be one really good, worthwhile way to make it happen. But before that happens, even more important is, most recently, I was part of a panel in which we were talking about robotics in agriculture. And there are many great solutions, but the key to all of this is actually business models, right? So nobody wants to buy equipment. What people want is to have a service. They want to have, faster weeding. Can you prove to me that you can do it faster than I could do it myself, and cheaper too? And that's, I think, another piece, right? So this old model of I'll sell you the equipment and I'll walk away, that should be over, right? So, and I think that's the main thing. It's around business models that have to do with renting, but not selling and throwing away, which is also, of course, very much in line with circularity. And I think those are the kind of business models. More has to be done also in education. And sorry that I'm going back to this, but I think it's important, because in that exact same panel that we discussed robotics, actually a farmer was saying, the problem is I cannot find enough people that are happy to work outside, but also understand how to use data, how to use this equipment and stuff like that, right? So data collecting is great, but you have to be able to teach people how to use those data effectively. So it's a combination of good education and good business models. And maybe there's something in there for policymakers to say to the folks that offer all the technology, to say, think about different business models that are much more flexible and variable. So not around fixed cost, you sell it and walk away, but go to circularity, go to renting and such like. So that's I think, one of the ways to do it. And that's again where the regulator, the policymakers can come in and actually say, hey, please, all of you can come into the country and work with my smallhold farmers, but you're going to have to think through different models. I think it's important that those lessons are taught early. And again, education is key. To me, it's the upstream factor that feeds the pipeline of all these great innovations and technologies.
Brilliant, thank you. And I do want to continue on the kind of business model, but also investment point, because we've talked a bit about research, innovation, and technology. But what about the financing specifically? So Andy, I am going to push you a little bit on this and just try and understand a bit more about the sustainable finance opportunities for investors at the moment. Why should or how can they more easily make those investments in this sector so that we can see some of these solutions come to fruition?
So what we see in our business, and we are currently the largest global food system innovation ecosystem, We have a whole host of startups. We're operating 6 accelerators across Europe and Israel. And what we see is that there is a genuine interest by wealthy family offices to come in and say, we want to make our money work to the benefit of society. It's impact investing, right? So, and there's impact investing summits and such like, and I think that's really the key, is to have a way to appeal to the impact investors with the offering that you have. So you've got to have a functioning ecosystem of startups. You've got to have a functioning ecosystem of larger players that are interested in collaborating with those startups, because if you were to invest in just startups in a region, it would take you 20, 30 years to do it. So you got to also attract large industry, as much as some folks don't like to hear that, right? So because larger players have a way to scale technologies, and if it makes sense, and all of those large players, if you look at it, they have impact goals that are very much aligned with both the investors and society as a whole. So things like reducing the footprint, the environmental footprint of their products and services. So I think, again, that's the way to do it, right? Is to really appeal with the offering that you have and the ecosystem. And that goes back to the platform/hub model, where you say, like, how can we make that happen? How can we attract all these different players, including the startups, so that impact investors are actually interested in coming in and putting money into this? So that's, I think, one of the things that's lacking, is really the bundling of the right offering for those impact investors, because they're out there, they're looking for investments.
Brilliant, thank you. I just want to remind the audience to pose their questions in the chat box so that they can come through to us as we start to begin to come to a close of the panel discussion. Obviously, we are going to carry on with this panel discussion, but just to remind people from the audience that they can weigh in and propose their questions to the audience. And I see that that's coming through at the moment. So just to also talk about broader innovation, Saswati, this is a point that you mentioned as well. You know, beyond technology, beyond the research, what are some of the innovations that we might need to see when it comes to policy or institutions and the way that we work, going beyond of course the core of it, the core research and innovation? Saswati, you're on mute. Maybe.
Sorry. I think one of the things, I think the broader innovation besides looking at technology, I think one was business model, which of course is, I think Andy already spoke very eloquently about it. I think one thing that we need to remember is also, why is there not much of innovation in business models? I mean, when we talk about incentives, we really need to also look at what are the incentives that we can provide for businesses to change. And a lot of times, I think we don't realize, I mean, recent studies said that 95% of all product innovations fail. So most of the times, large companies are not willing to dedicate significant resources to sort of test innovative models, and startups which are willing to do that, they don't have the funding. So really, how do we create a space within organizations by dedicating resources and creating the incentives, and also those pre-competitive collaborations that would be needed to really create those innovative approaches, but also to what are the incentive structures we need to create within organizations that promotes employees to take those risks and create those entrepreneurship that's needed. I think there are other big broader innovations is also, as you mentioned, I mean, is also looking financing and risk management. I mean, we see that there is a huge opportunity to really invest in more financing for mechanisms to support sort of, say, for example, infrastructure development in emerging economies, whether it's technology or physical infrastructure. There is opportunities where we need more patient and grant capital from investors to really look at creating those very innovative intermediation vehicles like green bonds and others, which can create plug-in financing to in emerging economies. But even otherwise, we see financing and insurance and others are a huge issue in emerging economies. So what are the innovations that we can bring, including through data and digital innovation, that can address some of the challenges and would sort of unlock the financing needs in supply chain. And then also the role of policies becomes quite important. I mean, policies and regulations can provide a huge incentives to and really create an enabling environment to promote technology and broader innovations. And so how do we support agile policy making? And what we are seeing a lot is that policies are the technology is moving a little bit more faster than how policies can keep up to it. So how do we help support governments to create those inclusive governance models which can leverage the role of technologies, but also ensure that we mitigate any unintended consequences related to, say, access or privacy and other concerns related to big data. But also like the incentives provided by policies and investments and subsidies in creating those physical and technology infrastructure will be huge in really unlocking some of these broader innovations. And of course, lastly is, of course, we need innovations in the institutional capacity. I mean, we need to really enable organizations to really create the scale and impact by really creating those innovations within organizations, whether it's supporting different, a different culture, which can really create this appetite to take those risks that would be needed to ensure that we meet some of these, and create a sort of a culture of innovation across food systems.
And here I'd like Sean to weigh in terms of this culture of innovation and taking risk in order to find solutions for our food systems. How is that at PepsiCo?
Well, I spent a lot of time talking about the EU Green Deal, and certainly our leadership team looks at that, to Saswati's point around the role of policy, because what that does is it creates a framework, and we look forward in a business to what it's going to be like to perform and to function within that new landscape. And what that identifies for us is it's a different landscape. There are things that will help us to drive our business forward, but there's also challenges. And so what it does is it promotes the innovation, because when you look at that level playing field, if you like, that's created by the regulation, what it does is it sends a strong signal, not only to PepsiCo, but to also universities and other players, that there will need to be something to unlock this situation. And that's what really spurs the innovation, because we're really looking at our existing system. And we used to think them as value chains. Maybe we think about them much more as systems now, recognizing that we are an integral part of the community. And we see that we need to change part of that system to be able to continue to perform in a new environment, such as what the EU Green Deal is bringing around. And that leads us to then frame strategies to invest to be able to unlock those problems and to be able to pursue our business interests in that environment. So certainly the aspect of regulations and standards really does create, at one point it creates a certain tension, but it also creates that motivation to innovate. And then it's really about how do we go about creating that innovation. And in some cases, what we've done is typically partner with institutions or universities that may already have strong programs, expertise, knowledge. So for example, we're working with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Learning because we've recognized that soil health and how farming sequesters carbon is very important when you think about going forward. I talked earlier about the fact that the question mark around pesticides, the use of industrial fertilizers, all of these things depend on a healthier soil to create a healthier crop that's more able to go through its life cycle without the support of those areas. So we look to that, and then we make investments, and that could be either offering scholarships to promote knowledge in that area, providing equipment to the universities so they can use the latest techniques to build the knowledge. But then once the knowledge is created, we also have to be able to carry that through. And as I mentioned earlier, this having platforms that allow us to put that knowledge on top of, and to be able to connect that to a local farmer in Turkey or Russia, where we're building a factory and we need to move a number of the farmers in that region to produce high quality crops for us. That's really how all of this comes together, I think, to create that drive to innovate and to make specific investments to create linkages through that system.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I want to really focus on the point where you were talking about the EU Green Deal and policy incentives, but also around, working together and reaching out to other platforms and organisations. Because we do have a question here from Selen, who's a student at TU, I think that's München, so Munich, and she wants to ask to the panel. She says, thank you for mentioning a holistic approach with all of the stakeholders to make an impact. But how do we relate this kind of multi-stakeholder approach when it comes to Europe's role in making that happen and engineering everybody to come around the table and work together? And I think for Andy, the question really is, how do you relate it to EIT's role? So I'll start with Andy with that question.
Thank you for this question. It's a great one. So I mentioned already that we as EIT Food, we've been around for 4 years, but there are other organizations like ours, and they're called here the Knowledge and Innovation Community. So EIT Food is the so-called KIC, and there are 7 others. There's some relating to health, climate. There's a climate KIC. There's an energy one, raw materials, urban mobility, manufacturing. So there's a number of KICs, and we're all operating in a similar fashion, right? So we all have the platform model where we connect all of the different partners together, all the different networks of stakeholders, and it's a model that many regions and countries in the world are quite interested in lately, particularly in the food system sector. I've had conversations with Brazil, with Food Tech Hub Brazil, but also with the country of Canada. But we also, as the EIT, so we have a funding agency that actually funds all the different KICs, of which, again, EIT Food is one of 8. And the EIT actually has outreach hubs that they set up. So there's one in Silicon Valley, there's one in Israel, one has just been opened in China, and we're just about to open another one in either Africa or South America. So we basically are looking to have a two-way communication with those larger regions. And what we can share here is a lot of knowledge, access to startups, and also access to that ecosystem of innovators. All of our partners, like Pepsi, they're interested in seeing what the local ecosystems have to do. And those outreach hubs that exist in those countries, and more of them that'll be set up, are actually the ones that'll bring the model to the different regions. And hopefully that will then spur much more development in a much more local fashion. But again, very happy to report that all of us, all the different KICs, we're all happy to share knowledge and experience that we've had, some of whom have had 10 years of this. So a lot of trial and error, a lot of learnings, and a lot of money invested in the whole ecosystem of startups and industry and universities, research centers, and government.
Thank you. And now I want to turn maybe to Saswati to just reflect on that question about, Europe's role really to make this kind of holistic approach work, or any examples that you see further afield that really work in making this holistic approach go forward.
Yeah, I think Maximo already highlighted a lot of like what Europe is doing in terms of it's within Europe on promoting this holistic approach. I think there is a huge opportunity, first of all, for European countries themselves to look internally and look at how do we create those integrated holistic approach, how do we create the right incentives to promote that kind of innovative solutions, but also look at it very collectively, like what are the implications of EU policies for the rest of the world? So what are the implications of the EU subsidy policies for the rest of the world? And so how do we make sure that we create really looking at it in a more of a global level on what are some of the trade-offs that could happen globally in some of the the impact some of EU policies could have for the rest of the world. Then the second way of Europe's role is also because it could really create a sort of European can invest a lot in many of these emerging economies, which really needs investments to support some of their work. So really prioritizing international development assistance, maybe in African and South Asian and other countries where the need is acute, to see like how do we European investment funding goes into supporting this holistic approach, and how do we promote also the innovation ecosystem approach in other regions, whether it's through support through these regional hubs, but also to create those capacity and learnings, and also share learnings across some of what's worked in Europe, to see also how this can be translated to some of the other regions in the world.
Brilliant, thank you, Siswati. And Maximo, you mentioned quite a few examples of what Europe is actually doing on a kind of a broader level, and also has implications beyond their own continent. But I suppose the FAO has members of around 200 countries. How do you see taking a holistic approach to food systems? What for you is the key drivers, and how do you really make sure that that happens?
Sorry, this is for Maximo.
Yes.
Okay, apologies. Look, I think that one thing that I have been hearing in the meeting is the issue of technologies and data. And I think one of the major issues with the private sector is not that they don't want to invest in a location. Sometimes it's that they don't have the information of what are the opportunities in those locations, and sometimes they will need some de-risking or some additional mechanisms to be able to do that. If we want to bring a holistic approach, I think we need to share as much as possible the information of the potential trade-offs that are going to happen across the different dimensions, and trying to help to align governments and private sectors and civil society, and also research and academia, so that the incentives are aligned. The problem we have today is that the incentives are not aligned. And these incentives are bringing a lot of distortions. And that's something that we need to be careful, how we can improve on the incentives and how we make them align. So I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, and of course, by no means least, Sean, would you like to weigh in on this conversation? I know you already picked up on the European Green Deal, but anything else from your experience about Europe's role in making this holistic approach happen?
Yeah, well, maybe if I reference, PepsiCo, Europe's role in PepsiCo to amplify the point. One of the aspects of the European Green Deal is to be an exporter, if you like, of the legislation and the framework to actually create that catalytic effect, that multiplier effect globally. And that's certainly something that has resonated within PepsiCo. So when I talk to my boss, Rene Lammers, the Chief Scientific Officer in the US, he's made it very clear to me that what's happening in Europe right now is being watched very closely by our global organization, because it's basically what they see as the leading edge of sustainability, nutrition, how these things are being brought together, both at a regulatory and an industry level. And so I'm being asked to make sure that as we tackle the problems as PepsiCo Europe, we're also thinking about how what we solve can also travel. And so when I think about building a technology and being able to use the infrastructure in Europe, which there's a huge amount of universities that have their roots in agriculture in Europe. It's one of the real aspects of the European, if you like, landscape. How do we build solutions that are actually going to be able to travel and to be able to, if you like, follow these frameworks as they're implemented globally, and to be able to be plug and play, so to speak, with those solutions? So for us, it's not just solving the problem for Europe, it's using Europe, if you like, as a proxy for how will some of these challenges be overcome, but also within the Europe ecosystem of private sector, industry and government, how can we have a multiplier effect as PepsiCo, where we are big and we're significant in the landscape, but we're not big enough to change everything. But where we choose to focus and where we choose to invest and innovate does have an impact, because it attracts support for that, but also when it works, there's a potential for us also to cut and paste that and to take that to other locations globally to amplify the benefit of what we've done.
Yeah, definitely. And as we draw this session to a close, I just want to kind of highlight a few of the key issues that we've been discussing, which is, we are here to discuss a global agenda, but we understand that it's incredibly important to really have just one global priority or a list of global priorities, and actually it's a hierarchy of the issues that we already know exist, and we need to make sure and consider the trade-offs within those hierarchies and those decisions that we make to put those onto the agenda. For instance, the cost of food versus the sustainable production of it. There was also a key discussion around data and education, the idea that we need to leverage big data, but that we also need to share it amongst these platforms, innovation hubs, academia and private sector, so that we can also have a better understanding of what those priority issues are, especially at the global level. And then obviously around stakeholder management or stakeholder engagement, how do we work across the private and public sector on these innovations, making sure that they relate to a global research framework and agenda, but also that they meet local needs. So how do we localize some of these global decisions and issues? And then we talked a lot about business models as well, beyond even the agri-food sector. So for example, how can telecoms come in and start supporting wireless connectivity so that we can deploy some of the innovation that is already there? Obviously, we spoke about a lot more. We have now around 4 minutes to go until we close this session. I will ask you for absolutely one thing, and that is really to answer the big question, which is what should be the first global agenda item on the UN Food Systems Summit regarding agri-food research and investment, innovation, and investment. If you could say, look, I know that there are a lot of other issues as well to discuss, but one specific topic that you think should be on that global agenda in this space, what would that be? And I'm going to start with Saswati.
I think I would say that I would prioritize really creating a leadership agenda towards realigning incentives. So I think we have heard that quite a bit today, but really, if we can create that opportunity to think through an integrated approach of what do we need to do to meet the multiple goals of food systems, and then how do we realign incentives which are now, which should sort of highlight the priorities of the 21st century. So really creating those incentives that will meet our needs for people and planet to meet our challenges of 21st century. So really looking at how do we create a leadership agenda to create those solutions which will really look at trade-offs and incentives in more detail.
Yeah. And can I ask Sean as well, please?
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize data. I think the collection, the structuring, the sharing and the education of both large and small farmers in how to use that data to take waste out of the system and to be able to apply the best practices. I think that's very powerful. And, like we talked about earlier, critical would be how do we share that data effectively and put it in the hands of farmers to their benefit.
And last but not least, Andy.
Yes, yes, thank you for the question. So I think one of the top priorities would be, in my view, a better coordination of all the different hubs and platforms that are springing up. So they're actually sprouting like mushrooms almost, and there is food waste, but there's also waste in reinventing the wheel. And I think there's a lot of learnings that are just not considered, just because there isn't a strong enough linkage between all of these initiatives. And if there's some kind of overarching body that can agree to say, let's put it all together, be the platform of platforms, so that at least there's a really great knowledge flow across all of these different initiatives, that would really be great. I think that would be a great first step to make happen. And then everything else will fall into place from there, because then you can learn about, aligned incentives and all that other stuff, So it all comes back to this connecting and coordinating.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for helping me wrap up the session, actually. It's hoped that this discussion today will provoke further thinking and discussions, including at the UN Food Systems Summit, about not only the global research priorities, but furthermore, the mechanics of how to deliver them in support of food system transformation. Thank you to panelists, Maximo, who's dropped off, but also Sean, Saswati, and of course, Andy, organisers at EIT Food and Forum Europe. Now I'm going to ask attendees to navigate back to the main stage for the closing remarks from Andy Singer, who is here and will be with you in just a moment. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.